Welcome to Law Society Younger Members Committee Career Information Session number 5. Fiona McNulty talks to Keith O'Malley about how to succeed in competency interviews.
Welcome everyone. I think I can see that we've lots of people logged in this evening, so welcome to everyone who's taken the time to sign up to tonight's webinar. It's one of a number of webinars that the Younger Members Committee and the Law Society are organising this autumn in lieu of our annual conference, which unfortunately did not go ahead this year, but we hope to be running it in 2021 as soon as possible. Tonight we are joined by Keith O'Malley, who is the Head of Career Support in the Law Society, and Keith will be talking to us this evening about competency interviews. And I don't know about everyone else on the webinar this evening, but certainly I didn't know a lot about competency interviews before I was preparing for this call, so I'm hoping that Keith will be able to give us a bit more information and insight and tips for anyone who might be looking at interviewing for a new role in the coming year, or they might be looking to apply for a promotion within their existing firm, or maybe for newly qualified solicitors who want some tips on how to present their experience in the best way. So to start off, Keith, for someone who has never heard of it before, what is a competency interview?
Okay, thanks, Fiona. Competency interviews are a certain kind of an interview that has been developed to try, in as far as possible, and remove bias from interviews. The traditional interview where you went in with your CV and they went through job to job, there was always that possibility that they could hit on, the interviewer could hit on something that they were particularly interested in and give you an easy interview. So this idea of a competency interview came up. It was actually an idea that was developed in the 1960s by the Israeli army in selecting commanders for their tank crews. And what they did was this young psychologist was asked to come up with some kind of a more scientific way of identifying tank commanders, rather than just well, he's burly looking and he looks like he's brave and smart. So he came up with this idea that you need to look at the job and identify what you believe was really important in the job that a person needed to have by way of capabilities, and then you go and you ask the person about those capabilities and whether they have those capabilities or not. Competency interviews are very often called behavioral interviews as well, because they're based around this idea that if you ask somebody about how they have behaved in the past, that tends to be a very, very good indication of how they're going to behave in the future. So behavioral interviews and competency competency-based interviews are exactly the same thing. And they're based around this idea of the employer identifies a number of abilities that they believe that a person needs to have in order to do the job. And they then ask people at interview about those particular competencies, and really don't ask about an awful lot else. If they do ask about other things, they don't mark the people on those, they just mark them on the competencies. When I say competencies, there's a little bit of extra in a competency interview. They tend to ask you about 5 or 6 competencies and about 1 or 2 motivations. So, a commitment to career is a motivation as opposed to a competency, but you can be asked about that as well. Or if you're going for a job in the public sector, you'll tend to be asked about public sector ethos and about how you feel about working in the public sector. So, competency interview is where the employer has identified things that they believe are particularly important for the job, and they ask about those particular issues, or they ask you questions about those matters at interviews, and they mark you for every question. And So at the end of a day of interviewing, an employer has a score for each person, because every person has been marked out of every 6 or 7 questions out of 10 by each interviewer on the other side of the table, and whoever gets the highest score gets the job. And sometimes, quite often, they'll have an additional rule within competency interviews that if somebody gets less than 50% on any score, they won't get the job. So not only do you have to do well on most questions, it's also important in a competency interview that you don't do particularly bad on 1 or 2 questions.
Okay. And from what you're describing there, you go into your interview and you're asked about your skills and your experience. How would you say that a competency interview is different from a traditional interview?
Yeah, a competency interview tends to revolve around a standard kind of a question, or historically tended to revolve around a standard question. And that question goes something like this. Communication skills are an important skill requirement in this job. Can you talk us through some time when you demonstrated good ability in the area of communication skills? So they tell you what they're interested in, and they ask you to tell them about something that some experience you've had, or sometime that you demonstrated particular ability in the area. And therein lies the key to competency interviews. They're very much historic in their orientation. The employer continually asks you about what you've done in the past, about your track record in your work or in your life to date, and what you're being asked really are to tell stories. So, as I just ran through the one about communication skills, this is important in the job. Can you tell us about some time when you demonstrated this ability in the past? So the questions are relatively easy and to a point repetitive, because they'll go through every competency with that same kind of a question. Now, what's happened, of course, over the years is employers realize that people get to know that they're going to be asked, a very typical kind of a question. So they have dressed up the questions in that, but they still come down to the same thing. With a competency interview, however they phrase the question, what they're asking you to do is to tell some story, is to tell a story to back up and to reassure them that you've got ability in whatever they're quizzing you about. So the standard way it is said to answer a competency question is to use what's called the STAR technique. And if you look at videos about competency interview, or anyone who's giving advice about interviews will always say use the STAR framework for answering questions. The STAR framework is situation. You describe a situation you found yourself in. Task, the job that faced you, or the problem that faced you. The A is action, the action you took, and R is the result you got. So when you're asked a competency question, as quickly as possible, get into telling them a story, and you explain a situation you found yourself in, a task or a problem that you had to overcome, the action you took, and the result you got. And that's how, at its most basic level, that's how you get through a series of competency questions at a competency interview.
Okay, so that's STAR: situation,
task,
action,
result.
Okay.
Yes.
And in your experience, Keith, because obviously you would work with solicitors and firms across all sizes and sectors, how common are competency interviews in Ireland? Are they a common feature? Are they maybe not necessarily described as a competency interview, but they are in fact a competency interview? What would be your experience?
if you go for an interview in any kind of a large organization, so you know, any large or medium-sized legal firm, any kind of government job, educational institution, anything else like that, you're going to almost certainly be interviewed using Competency Framework. The Law Society started interviewing by using Competency Framework 2 to 3 years ago. It is pretty much across the board, and even where you're not you know, subjected to a competency interview, you'll find that more and more questions, even in a, you know, a looser kind of an interview, are still phrased so often in a competency kind of a way. So they're really, it's important to get on top of them. They're not a particularly difficult interview because you can prepare very well for them. You know the questions largely that you're going to be asked. You know the kind of an answer that the employer is likely to be looking for. So you need to prepare, and you need to get yourself really ready to go in and give a good account of yourself, because you're going to be up against other people who have done that kind of preparation.
And when you say you know the kind of questions that the employer is going to be asking, is that because you will be if you have a well-drafted or detailed job advertisement, are you hoping that the details in the job advertisement and the job spec will give you the information you need to prepare? Is that where you would suggest that the preparation and information goes?
Yeah, there's a number of ways of what we're talking about here, of course, is identifying the competencies that you're going to be asked about, because if you know what they are, you know what that's what you're going to be quizzed about. That's what they're going to question you about. So how do you find out competencies? Quite often they will actually identify the competencies. An awful lot of public sector jobs now, towards the end of the application form, if you're asked to fill out an application form, they will actually listen. They will say, tell us about any achievements you've had in the area of managing results and or judgment and decision making, or communication skills, or teamwork, or whatever the competency is that they're keen on. So very often, in order to apply, you're already being quizzed even prior to interview about the competencies, and then at interview you're going to be asked about the same things again. In other jobs, for example, you go to the Law Society, you apply for a job in the Law Society, they won't tell you what the competencies are, but they're very easy to identify. They tend to be the things that are listed as essential requirements within the job description, or identified as important in the advertisement. So if you have any problem identifying competencies for a job, ask somebody else who has some HR experience, and they'll identify them really fast. So they can highlight them for you very quickly.
Okay. What about the situation where you're looking at a job, you say that looks really interesting, but it doesn't necessarily fit with my experience? Maybe you're working in conveyancing and you've always been interested in family law, and you see a job about family law. Have you any tips or thoughts on how you can connect, maybe where your experience as a solicitor doesn't necessarily match with the job description, how you could marry the two?
Yeah, well, that's a challenge for all interviews, isn't it? It goes beyond competency interviews, and what we're talking about here is there is something that you can practice at, and you can get quite good at building bridges, building connections between what you've done and what an employer is looking for. And people who get skilled at that can really do well in terms of putting themselves forward for a job which is really quite different to what they've done before. And it's where an employer says, well, it's really important that the person has good court experience, and somebody else says, well, from my, as you see from my experience is mainly transactional. However, there's a huge amount of, we deal with contentious matters, and we deal with, trying to find, common ground all the time within my work. So I believe I have a huge amount to, that I could very quickly and with ease transfer across and work very effectively within a litigation kind of environment. So it's that thing of building links between what you have and the experience you have, and between what the employer is looking for. And if that's done well, an employer interviewer will take it on board and be very receptive.
Okay, I can see there's already some really good questions coming in on the chat function, and just a reminder to everyone who's on the webinar this evening, you can type in questions either on the chat, or you can ask a question. One here, Keith, is someone is wondering, what are the top 2 or 3 competencies required for a legal position? So is there anything that you would see when you're looking at competency interviews or questions? Do you see any common thread that would be running through a lot of the roles?
Yes, there's this wonderful document which is the Public Appointments Competency Framework, and anyone who's going in for a competency interview should download a copy of this. It's about 16 pages in total. It starts with this graphic of all the competencies that are required for all public sector jobs, and then it goes through every job, and I'm going to talk more about it. But if you want to know about competencies and the kind of competencies that come up, this is a great document. There are not, we generally, you don't find competencies are particular to legal jobs. You don't get a situation where you're being asked for, are you capable of taking judicial reviews, and are you capable of alternative dispute resolution. What interviews tend to do much more in terms of competencies are they always reach for the same competencies, and they tend to be around multitasking, they tend to be around communication skills, they tend to be around teamwork, judgment and decision making, those kind of matters. They tend to be not so much specific to legal skills. That there tends to be one, and that is applying your legal skills. But competencies generally are not particularly focused on legal skills. This framework, that the Public Appointments Framework, works very well.
Okay.
And it reflects the kind of things that you're going to be asked about.
All right, I might try and see if we can get a link to that, and we can share that on the chat for people to have a look at as well by the end of the call. So if anyone on the webinar was applying for a competency interview, what would they need to know about what makes a good competency interview? What would success look like? How would you prepare for it?
Okay, if I could start, Fiona, with just touch on I guess the traditional mistakes that people make, and then what I'll do is talk about how somebody can do a good competency interview, and then if we've got time, hopefully we can talk about how somebody can do great at a competency interview. But the classic kind of 4 errors that people make on competency interviews is, number 1, they don't tell a story. It's really important that you tell a story, and if you don't tell a story, you're in trouble. Secondly, the story is not detailed enough. They gloss over, and the story doesn't have any great depth, and it doesn't really give the interviewers a chance to get an understanding of your capability in the area that you're being asked about. And thirdly, where the person uses we rather than I. So they tell about a project that they were involved in, and they continually refer to, well, we did this and we did that. And the interviewers have no idea how much this particular person has done. So if you are going to talk about work that you've done on a project. You talk about what you did within the project, and you know, you focus on what you did. And the last one, that the absolute mortal sin when it comes to competency interviews, is to say, well, actually, I don't have any particular ability in that area. You know, if you're asked, multitasking is an important part, requirement in this job. Can you talk us through your ability to multitask? And you say, well, actually, you know, I'm sorry, but I'm just not a good multitasker. You're not going to go any further. So they're the 4 mistakes. What I'm now going to do, if it's okay, is talk through 4 things that tend to make a good performance at a competency interview. So if somebody wants to do well at competency interview, they need to do the following 4 things. They need to tell a story. If you don't tell a story, you know, you're in trouble. And there's a tendency, there's a risk sometimes, particularly if you're asked about something that you're very interested in. If they say, you know, innovation is an important part of this job, can you tell us about some time when you demonstrated an ability in the area of innovation? You might have lots of stories to tell them, but you're so interested, and you talk about, you know, how people can do well out of innovation, and the philosophy about innovation and that kind of thing. Your time is up, and they, when they review your answer, they said, well, you know, she or he didn't tell us a story about, you know, having success within the area of innovation. So we must presume that they didn't, they don't have that. The second one is to try and, you know, in as far as you can, tell an interesting story. And so, you know, if you're asked, well, conveyancing knowledge is an important part of this job, can you talk us through some time when you demonstrated a really in-depth experience of conveyancing? And you talk through, well, you know, I did a particularly big job on conveyancing, and this is what I did, and you talk through what you did, and, you know, it's pretty kind of featureless. Well, you know, you're going to bore the people on the other side of the table, you know, to death. Good stories tend to have a problem, a challenge, you know. So you found yourself in a situation, you were faced with the following challenge, you know, which complicated things. You decided to do the following, which showed that you understood, and you had a good feel for whatever the competency they're asking about. If it's multitasking, that you really, you know, got to grips with multitasking, and you produce the results. So try in as far as you can, you know, make sure that your story has a problem or a challenge in it. We do talk about STAR: situation, task, action, and result. What people do is, by way of mistake, is they answer using the SAR framework. They describe a situation, they talk through the action they took and the result they got. And that is not nearly as good a story as a STAR story. So tell a good story. Be able to rotate your stories. There's a problem at a competency interview sometimes. If you identify the competencies that you're going to be asked about, and you line up all your stories, and you then go in for an interview, and you're not asked about the competencies in the way you thought you were going to be asked. You can run into a problem if you haven't kind of practiced and you haven't readied yourself to be able to rotate your story. So going into a competency interview, you should have about 10 or 12 good stories, and those stories by and large should be used for particular stories. But if you use one and you need another story, you've always got, you can use another one of your 10 or 12 stories to tell that. And what I'm talking about here is, say you're expecting a question on innovation and enterprise, and you go in and sure enough, they ask you, okay, innovation is an important part of this job, blah, 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 and can you tell us about some time when you had particular success in the area of innovation, and you tell your story. And then a question or two later, they say, oh, enterprise is an important part of this job. And you're stumped. You say, oh, I only had one story for innovation enterprise. What you do is you just delve into that group of 10, 12 stories and you say, what story is most appropriate now? And you give that story. So you need to be able to, if you can, rotate your stories. And if you can, try and tell stories that are relevant to the job. And it is said quite often, you know, if in advice about interviews, generally with competency interviews, if you don't have a story related to your work, tell a story about, you know, something you did in your leisure activities, maybe, you know, Cub Master in the Scouts or something else like that. We're talking, you know, here today to people who are solicitors. So, you know, you've done a lot of training, you've worked in a legal firm for quite a while. And if you're being asked about 6 or 7 different competencies, you know, I think you should be able to come up with a story that's linked to your work for each of those. Yes, if you're stuck and if you have a particularly good story that's linked to another job you did in the past before, or linked to something you've done in your own personal life, you could tell that story. But the story that tends to that interviewers relate most to are stories that are very closely associated with the job that you've applied for. So that's how to do good at interview. Tell a good story, or tell a story. Firstly, make sure you tell a story. Secondly, tell a story that's interesting and should engage people on the other side of the table. Be able to rotate stories if you can, and also trying to tell stories that are relevant to the job, so that are work orientated and work focused, as opposed to things you did in other you know, leisure interests and that kind of thing. Will I talk about how to do great at an interview, Fiona?
You can. I'll just give you one question that we have coming in, and someone is wondering, what will we do if the employer doesn't want to listen to your story? And maybe that might tie in with something I was wondering, if you feel that a competency interview is something that you would do really well at, and that it would show off your skills and your strengths, but your employer maybe isn't used to doing competency-based interviews, if that's not their style. Is it something that you could suggest, do you think, to your employer?
I think, well, we're talking about competency interviews here. I guess if you go into an interview which is not a competency interview, and you decide to answer a non-competency question with a competency answer, maybe that's not the most appropriate thing. And you know, you need to give an employer you know, generally what they're looking for. So, you know, I would stay within the realm of what they're looking for. But I think in the main, during a competency interview, they always are looking for information. One of the great problems of competency interviews is the employer doesn't feel that they get enough information about what the person did and how they did it.
Yeah. Okay, well, the time is just 28 minutes past 7, Keith, so you have 2 minutes to tell us how to do a great competency interview.
Okay, great, thank you. What you need to do, in as far as you can, is align what you want to talk about with what the interviewer is most likely interested in. And that's why this framework is really good, because there's a third page here which it deals with, what are they called? The performance indicator. So for every competency, they say they're kind of, there's about 4 or 5 different examples of how that competency might be demonstrated. And the problem with competency interviews is hard work. You know, I might have a certain view of hard work, you might have a different view, the interviewer might have a different view. So what you try and do, and as far as possible, a competency interview, is you're going to tell a story, and your story is going to be focused on what you think is important in the competency. But before you launch into your story, start by saying, you know, if it's communication skills, so, well, I believe I have good communication skills. I have communication skills that do this, do this and do this. And you try and cover as many bases as you can. Don't, list 6, but list 3 of the performance indicators that are listed here. And what you're trying to do here is, if you have a certain view of hard work and our communication skills, and the person on the other side of the table has a different view of hard work, you're trying to align that as much as possible. So if you touch on something that they're interested in, even if you then go on and tell a story which is more focused on your view of the competency, at least you mentioned in your introduction, you touched on what they're interested in. So great idea. Before you launch into your, terribly important to tell a story, but before you launch in, say, well, actually, I have a particular ability in this area, and I have it that's reflected in, and you name off a number of performance indicators, and you'll get them from this booklet. The second one is to make sure that your story, the story you tell, is appropriate, at an appropriate level. If you're going for a management job, they're going to, and you've never had a management job managing people, they're going to ask you about your ability to function at the level at which they're looking to hire. So the question they ask, if you answer it telling a story about just working in your own and taking care of your own work, it's not going to do well enough. If you're going for a managerial job, make sure that the story you tell reflects management capability. Thirdly, I'm trying to, sorry, yes, in as far as you can, reference back to the job. It's great that when you tell a story, if you can say, and I think what I've just been telling you about is particularly important for this job because you bed it down in what's the job and what they're looking for. And the last one is rehearse. Please do a number of mock interviews before you go in to do a real interview. I say all the time, people are asked to become a best man at a wedding, and they go off and they join Toastmasters for 6 months, but they toddle off into an interview, and expect to win over people on the other side of the table with their natural charm. You can do much better at an interview if you run through it a few times beforehand with family, friends, or with trained interview guides. It doesn't matter. What you need to do is sit down and be asked questions and have to answer them and come up with the responses. This is even more important, of course, now because we're doing Zoom interviews. So not only do you at the moment have to cope with doing competency interviews, but you've got to do them in the Zoom format. So what I would plead with everyone to do is to make sure that you do 2 or 3 competency interviews before going, mock interviews before going on to a real one. And ideally do 1 or 2 of those in a Zoom framework. So, across using cameras and see how you get on.
And I suppose finally, Keith, going forward, how important do you think it is for lawyers to be good at competency interviews? Are they going to be more and more relevant or less so? What would be your sense?
I don't think they can get too much more relevant because they're absolutely central now. And I would see a lot of solicitors or lawyers, in fact, I see it more with barristers for whatever reason, particularly in the public sector, who have run into a problem. They can't get that promotion because they haven't been able to understand what's being looked for within a competency interview. They get some interview training and bang, it works for them. So competencies are very much a structured and stylized selection method, and if you don't understand what the employer is looking for, and you don't understand how to effectively give the employer that, you're not going to do as well as you could otherwise do.
Okay. And I think what Michelle Nolan has really helpfully put into the chat is the link to that competency model wheel that you were showing, and the details about the competency skills on the sheet over, so people will be able to access that. And I think we might send an email to attendees as well afterwards with that link. So Keith, that's been a fantastic whistle-stop tour of competency interviews. I think I have gotten some really good tips that I've made a note of, and the feedback on the chat as well. Thanks to everyone who's sending their compliments into Keith for all that helpful information. Thanks to everyone for logging on this evening, and we hope to see you all soon. Every Tuesday night for the next couple of weeks we'll have Younger Members Committee webinar, so hope to see some of you again soon.